Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Hollis, Programme Lead at Nolex, and standing in for Alistair Yoxall, who's unfortunately otherwise engaged quite urgently. Today, within this webinar, we're going to be looking at sustainability and the role of single-use products in hygiene and infection control. I suppose we're starting with a question of sustainability in cleaning and hygiene. We often hear the mantra to move away from single-use products. In a word, is it that simple? And to now introduce you to our panel of experts who are going to guide us through this. Can I begin with you, Mark?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody. Mark Wilcox. I presume we were just on the introduction part.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Mark Wilcox. I'm a medical microbiologist, consultant and professor in Leeds. I also have roles for NHS England as a national clinical director.
Thank you. Emma.
Hi, yeah, Emma Brooks, Head of Soft FM Strategy and Operations at NHS England.
Thank you. Katie?
Hi, yeah, Katie Laird, Professor of Microbiology at De Montfort University and Head of the Infectious Disease Research Group.
Thank you. And going back to that question of the removal of single-use products, in a word, is it that simple? Mark?
No, I mean, it's a loaded question, quite rightly. But I think the governing principle here when one's deciding on whether it's a single-use product or a multi-use product is what is the optimal way of protecting individuals, there are clearly some instances, and this is quite common amongst infection prevention and control, for example, where single-use products are absolutely required. There'll be other instances where there's not really much of an argument, where one could use a multi-use product. In between those two extremes, that mantra about needing to use what's most fit for purpose, I think fits. Is paramount. And just going to say one more thing is that the arguments about the green credentials of one product, one way of doing things versus another, are extraordinarily complex. And often those calculations ignore distribution chains, manufacture of the products themselves, the energy used to keep them functioning, to keep them maintained, and so on. So I go back to my starting point that we should be using the product that is most fit for purpose, and whilst perhaps waiting for genuinely multi-use versions to come along, which may not happen. Over.
Thank you. Emma?
So I totally agree with Mark. I mean, a really good instance of this is around we'll just throw in hand dryers everywhere without actually looking at the overarching use of hand towels. So a lot of organisations will go for the cheapest hand towel. So that means you need 4 or 5, 6, half a pack to dry your hands properly to give you the right infection control benefits, when actually if we used a better recyclable product, that meant you could use one and dry your hands sensibly. The hand dryer may not be a better product, because even if they're low energy, we're still using energy. If there are, they have to be maintained. There's a number of things around this. So it's about organisations looking at things holistically. to be able to say, actually, what is the right space for us to create those carbon reductions? There will always be a need for some single-use products, especially across healthcare and throughout infection control. But it's about how do we look at this in the right way and not just do a knee-jerk, right, well, we're saving paper, let's go for an electronic hand dryer. And some of those are worse for infection control when we look at the ones where they're spraying stuff back up at us.
Yeah, I'll come back to you in a minute on that, Mark. Katie, in your experience in textiles, how would you address that question of single use from an infection control and hygiene perspective?
Well, I agree with Mark and Emma that you do need single use in some instances. And I think the other issue we have is that I think we need a lot of people with different expertise to look at the problem, because if you just look at it from one particular angle, you're not always seeing the bigger picture, which filters into like manufacturing, etc. So actually some of the approaches that we take towards making these decisions needs to be sort of multifactorial, multiple experiences. I think we can talk about, when we talk about textiles, it's obviously that IPC need against the sustainability need, against cost needs. And another example that I suppose fits in with what Emma was saying was disinfectant wipes. So it's the quality of the wipe. Is it just the removal via, say, the ply of or the actual what it's manufactured from, so whether it's microfiber and picking up and removal? Do you use more if they're a certain brand, etc.? You can't just choose one particular element of it to focus on. And I think that real holistic view to looking at these issues is really important.
Going back to Mark, obviously you're an international C. diff expert, and I know you've done a lot of research into the issue of hand drying. And from purely an IPC perspective, what solution is best?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Look, if we consider the different ways of drying hands, I mean, I'm sure just about everybody on the call will get it, that the hand drying part of hand hygiene is a fundamental part. It's not just a nice to have if you can be bothered on the end, because you can undo all the good you've done and possibly make things worse if you don't dry your hands adequately. Wet hands transfer bugs more readily, and they probably accept more bugs readily. So if you consider the different ways of drying hands, you can absorb the water by using a towel, typically a paper towel, but not necessarily always. Alternatively, you can use an electric dryer. How do they work? It's very, very simple. They shear off the water from hands. In shearing the water away from hands, some of them are very good at drying hands, some less so. But by doing that, shearing the water off, where does it go? It doesn't just magically go down a plug hole. It doesn't just magically go into a gutter in the design of certain hand dryers. Where the water goes is into the environment of the washroom, onto the person drying their hands, and or onto the people elsewhere in the washroom. And we've shown that the water droplets can travel meters, and the smaller droplets, more to the point, can remain suspended for tens of minutes in the air, available potentially to breathe in. And the crucial part about that is that, as I'm sure, again, most people on the call will get it, when you wash hands and you've got this moisture left on your hands, that moisture is absolutely not clean, sterile moisture. It is bug contaminated moisture. The degree with which it's contaminated will depend on how well you've washed your hands. So if I can be sexist and say you've done a typical male hand wash involving no soap and just wafting hands briefly under a tap, there'll be more bugs in that water than perhaps the average female hand wash. But there will be bugs, female or male hand wash, and some of those bugs will be very unpleasant bugs that one has acquired during toileting, or you already had them. You already had your flu virus on your face, on your hands, and so on, and then they're sheared off into the environment. So, a well-designed air dryer, electric dryer, could mitigate some of that risk. Most of the dryers that I've seen and we've worked with do not mitigate the risk. They absolutely transmit, splatter the risk around the washroom.
Thank you. And Katie, I don't know whether you've done any work around this or have some opinions, but those hand dryers towels on a roll that you frequently see, what the sort of infection and maybe sustainability implications of those? Obviously, they appear to be a simple reusable product, but
well, it's quite complex in that the microorganisms can survive on it for a sustained period of time. Now, depending on the fibre type, depends how long they can survive. So, for instance, if you take a cotton, the bacteria is able to survive on it for weeks potentially, whereas a virus, when we looked at coronavirus, it was absorbed into the textile in a cotton fibre and desiccated, so not easily transferred. Whereas you look at more polyester based, the bacteria tend to not survive as long because there's no moisture there for them, no nutrients, whereas the viruses tend to sit on top of that on top of the polyester and are more transferable. So it's not as simple as this textile is just harbouring this microorganism. It's much more complex than that. It comes down to fibre type, even weave. In terms of the disinfection of those types of products, there is actual wash standards that are specifically listed within the risk management systems of healthcare laundries, particularly for those roller towels. So they are able to be fully disinfected, and I think that is adequate. However, it's that period of time that it's sitting within the washroom, and also if people are not pulling it down and are not using maybe a new section of the roll towel, that's where the issue is, and there is potential for transfer. But saying that, you've also then got to think about the transportation and replacement of those fabric towels, roller towels, and also then the water usage, the temperature usage, the chemical usage that then is required to disinfect them, which I'm not an economist, so I can't calculate the difference between buying lots of paper towels compared to doing that. But as I said, it's that multifactorial where we need to bring other expertise in to look at this from different angles as well. So
okay, thank you. I'll just say, by the way, to the audience present that we will be taking questions in the chat, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can as we go along. When we decide to use a product for cleaning, infection control, and try and do that sustainably, how do we address, I suppose, what are we trying to achieve? Emma, in terms of specifying those products, or in terms of choosing them for use in cleaning, obviously with sustainability in mind, how would you approach that? I mean, what are the questions you would ask yourself in terms of, I suppose, what you're trying to achieve?
I think it's very much, we've talked about this already, it's very much a balanced approach. We've got to look at infection prevention. We do have a number of, very vulnerable people within our healthcare settings, but there's also, there will always be the need for some single-use products, especially where we're dealing with some, and I'm sure Mark will appreciate this, some very nasty things out there. But at the same time, we need to look at how do we weigh that up. So a good example would be, gloves. single-use aprons. We use them far too much. We don't need to put gloves on to do high dusting, for example. There is not a risk to the user. In days gone by, cleaning operatives, nurses, they would all have had, you know, reusable aprons that would have gone in the wash as part of their uniform. And for day-to-day activities where we're talking about just general splashes, especially our cleaning operatives from just our standard chemicals and water, is quite appropriate. So those are the things we need to be starting to look at, because actually the especially since COVID, we've kind of all gone to, let's just put on disposable gloves and a plastic apron for everything we do and use that as the fallback. So it's about how do we look at things in a slightly different guise to protect our patients and our staff, but actually let's, you know, we need to look at what's appropriate and where we use those products.
Katie, in terms of textiles, what would your approach to be in making a choice with sustainability at the back of what you're doing?
I think in terms of healthcare textiles, they are washed in accredited laundries that have, they've got a BSCN 14065, which ensure that they are clean to go out, microbiologically clean, should I say, not just visually clean, to go out and come back into that healthcare environment being safe. Now, the industry as a whole is very much aware of its environmental credentials and is looking to move towards less water use and lowering temperatures. But this in itself has issues then that more chemistry will need to be used. So there's a balance there. And I know the industry are looking at that. But as the research we did quite early on in the pandemic showed, you can remove microorganisms from textile and washing is an option. So, and it is monitored because, as Emma said, you know, you've got very vulnerable patients, but those laundries that are servicing healthcare environments are under strict regulations that they do have to follow. So from that terms of sustainability and the need, I agree again with Emma, the apron and the gloves continuously being used are just not needed, and actually washing your hands is more effective at times than using the gloves themselves. So I think from a sustainability perspective, the textiles, and the other thing is with textiles, they can be recycled at the end. So you've got that recyclability in textiles as well, although mixed polycottons are harder to recycle, and actually it's better if the choice again, and this is where it comes down to those choices and how they feed into that, is it would be better to use a pure cotton or a pure polyester because of the end of life usage. But there is programs within the industry as well that textiles, particularly from say hospitality, that are not where they can be reused in hospitality again, but are in good working order, can be donated and reused for different charities, etc. So in that instance, it's much more sustainable and goes beyond just an individual setting. But there is obviously, there is benefits where single use absolutely have to be used, and I think that's what we need to bear in mind. It's on the situation and the environment you're in at any one time.
Okay, Mark, is this a challenge you face in the lab?
Yes. Let me give you sort of two examples. One indeed that everyone will be familiar with. So our lives were transformed during the pandemic by little white plastic strips called lateral flow devices or lateral flow tests. Yep. An approximate estimate is that we used about 2 billion of them in the UK. So many billions, probably trillions worldwide. Initially, they were not. They were mass produced with very little thought about environmental concerns. But then gradually, during the pandemic, there was a shift to using recyclable plastics, and other components and so on. And that microcosm of a couple of years just shows how obviously initially it wouldn't be a prime concern about environmental impact. That was overridden by the infection need, the infection prevention and control need, just as we said earlier on, choose the best thing available for the job at hand. But then evolution, rapid evolution in this case, comes along, and you can actually make significant difference into the design, manufacture, recycling of said products. And that example holds true for other tests and so on that we use in the laboratory. The other example, which is not specific to laboratory, I'll just briefly mention, is we are increasingly concerned about the risks of contamination of sinks, plugs, plug holes, pipes, drains, and so on. And there's good evidence that those sites are sources of potentially extremely resistant gram-negative bacteria. So there is a move towards water-free, waterless clinical settings. And clearly what has driven that move is a need to protect individuals, infection prevention and control, not a need to save on use of water. But you could potentially have both going on towards the same end. Such moves will require novel products to come along because alcohol-based products are not effective on certain viruses, not effective on spores, C. diff spores, for example. But there are products coming along that will actually do the job of cleaning and decontaminating the hand, regardless of which bug is there. So that's a nice twist on the environmental sustainability argument when one considers water-free environments.
Thank you, Mark. And what we'll do now, I think we have a number of questions from the audience. We had a number of questions to start off with. So for those people out there, I suppose without particularly a scientific background, who need to be able to make these choices, can we go through a few scenarios and get your opinions on them? So essentially, to begin with, just for personal use, paper tissues or a reusable cloth handkerchief. Katie.
Slightly loaded question because it sort of depends when and how you're using it, actually. So I'm not entirely sure there's a right or wrong answer here. So I think we know we can decontaminate textiles with high temperature use as long as the textile allows for that. Because if we look at nurses' uniforms, for instance, they don't necessarily go up to the temperature that we need to be able to decontaminate them. But if the cloth is able to be disinfected, then I would say I would use the cloth. But that said, you need some type of protocol in place to advise at what point it needs washing, when it needs washing, how many uses it has. Because if we think about wipes, we should only be doing it in one direction. So are we doing that with textiles? And the other thing is microfibers, for instance, pick up microorganisms much more readily, but in some recent tests we've found that they're much more difficult to launder the microbes out of them because purely for the fact that they were there to pick them up in the first place, so they're retaining them. So I'm not entirely sure I've answered your question there because I think it really depends on the situation, but if we're using it in a healthcare environment, paper versus textile cloths, I think there needs to be not a sort of a risk analysis around that, because you would have to launder and use them appropriately.
Okay, thank you. And Emma, we've had one in which is really looking at cleaning and the use of paper towels in cleaning surfaces and so on. Obviously, you've recently launched a new version of cleaning standards. What's the sort of guidance around that in that? What's your advice in those instances on surface cleaning? Yeah.
My first advice is I hope no one's using paper towels to clean any surfaces.
Okay.
They either should be using a washable microfiber product or a single-use product, dependent on what they're cleaning and where. And that includes both catering facilities and across the healthcare establishment. If anyone's using paper towels, please contact me urgently.
Okay. And another question, and I think there's somebody in an ultrasound unit, but they are being requested to use linen covers, I think, rather than white paper roll. I don't know, except for preparing the area where people lay on when having an ultrasound test. And as they're saying, so every time they have a patient now, it means that linen has to sort of go back and be washed. Obviously, we're looking at getting rid of the disposable issue, where I would have thought there's quite a big sustainability concern and carbon concern in that linen being continually washed and disinfected. Mark, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hadn't come across that. I humbly suggest that move may have been a knee-jerk response and not particularly thought through. And I see both Emma and Katie thankfully nodding with me, because I struggle to see how that switch would have any greener credentials. I think you'll introduce some levels of risk around the contaminated, low-level contamination, fiber materials, fabrics that then need to go for processing. There's all the manual handling of that, transport, washing, reverse processes, and so on. And I'd be very surprised if that stacked up against sensibly sourced paper products. And it's slightly different here from the important points that Emma was making earlier on, that if you use certain paper towels that are poor quality, then Emma quite rightly said what happens. The quality, providing the paper on the couch, on the bed, is of sufficient quality not to tear as soon as someone comes into contact with it. You're not looking for high quality, high expense, high manufacture cost paper products. So that's a long answer to I'm dubious, would be the shorter response.
Emma, do you have a view on that?
I totally agree with Mark. I think, people have to look at the whole picture. It's not always about that knee jerk that because it's reusable, it's going to be better and save us carbon and change the way we work. It's about looking at that whole thing. So if you are now sending, an extra 1,000 bags of laundry a week, based on the carbon footprint of getting that to the laundry, back from the laundry, the water usage, the chemical usage, all of that, is that better than as Mark said, a well-sourced product that doesn't tear the minute someone looks in its direction, and essentially could be part of a circular economy. It might be something that, yes, we can put it in this bag and it goes off and it can be recycled and then becomes toilet paper or hand towels or something else. So it's about people looking at things in a slightly different way, not just a knee-jerk reaction to, well, that's a single-use product, this is a reusable, so it must be better.
Indeed. Katie, have you anything to add to that?
I think if the laundries themselves were getting thousands of, I completely agree with everything that's been said, but if the laundries themselves were getting thousands of bags of that type of textile, they wouldn't be able to cope either. And I think most probably from a sustainability and safety point of view, their focus is most probably better on scrubs, bed linen, etc., than those where it's most probably more commensal type microorganisms that are on them.
Thanks. And the next one that's come in, washable theatre hats, Katie. Maybe start with you. There are a couple of somebody has asked, are washable theatre hats preferable to disposable from a sustainability and IPC issue? And secondly, is it wise for staff to take those hats home and wash them themselves?
I think if we're talking about surgery, they need to be more like clean room processed type laundry, because of the type of work that's happening within theatres. Definitely shouldn't be taken home to be washed themselves. I mean, I don't agree with the uniforms going home to be washed themselves, so but that's a whole different debate. So no, absolutely not. But again, it comes back to that safety and what's the appropriate IPC within a theatre environment, particularly the high contamination that's sometimes seen in surgical site wounds. And I think in those instances, it may be that single use is better than launderable ones, but because they would have to be, in my opinion, I don't know, Mark and Emma might have a different on the more of the sterile side.
Emma?
So, I mean, I think it would, if you're using reusable, it has to be on the sterile side and go through the proper sort of laundry facility using the HTMO 104. I think that's really key. It's not something that we should be saying this is, and I'm not going to get into the debate about uniform, Katie, but generally, if we are talking about sterile products that are being used in theatres where there's quite a high risk issue, that should be something that goes through the laundry process and comes back packed as a sterile product.
Okay, and to go to more of the questions we were asked, probably beginning with you, Emma, disposable mop heads. I didn't know there was such a thing before this, actually. Where are they used, and when is it preferable to have one that you do reuse?
Okay, so when they should be used would be for highly infectious cases. So something that we're saying that we would not be confident could be decontaminated, bearing in mind that many organisations have their own sort of in-house laundry for things like mops and cloths. Sometimes they're also used for nurse cleans if they're picking up body fluids, generally because they're trying to do that quickly and then call in the cleaning operatives to do a secondary clean. There is probably a continuous need for them, but perhaps not on the basis that they have been used since COVID. There has been a bit of, again, a knee-jerk to move towards using a lot more disposable mop heads. There'll always be a small place for them where they're really required, where we want to know that infectious product has gone in the right waste stream.
Okay, and Mark, be interested in your view on this. I imagine a mop is able to harbour quite a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Emma. The exceptional cases, certainly not the rule. And then the key to the non-disposable mop heads, which we're saying should be the norm, is how are they cleaned, how are they stored, and basically you don't store them wet, damp, still contaminated, they need to go for processing, cleaning, dried, stored dried, and so on. It's not just the mop heads, it's the machines that are also used sometimes to clean floors, where there's evidence that these can become contaminated with multi-drug resistant gram-negatives, and several hospitals have found problems there. And then unfortunately they're very efficient at disseminating said organisms. But the mop heads, that's one that's quite easy. Actually, it's a nice one to bring up, that the great majority should be reprocessed, should not be single-used, but reprocessed properly.
Thank you. And Katie, anything to add to that?
I completely agree. It's about appropriate use, because there has been studies, and I'm sure Emma and Mark have seen these, where we've actually got microorganisms growing in mop buckets within the water because the disinfectants haven't been used appropriately. In this case, it's most probably more to do with the disinfectant that's been used with the mop rather than the mop. So again, it comes back to my point when I was saying about towels versus paper towels for hand drying and things. You need an appropriate system in place to decontaminate and know how to use appropriately, but absolutely we should be using reusable mops.
There's a much liked question that's come in, which is or point for discussion, I suppose. Why do theatre caps need to be sterile? Scrubs are not sterile. Mark?
Yeah, I was going to interject earlier. I don't think they don't need to be sterile, because the greens or the blues, whatever colour garments that are donned by the theatre workers are not sterile. They're high level cleaned, and the purpose of the hat is not to create a sterile head. It's to stop loose hair and the bugs that live on loose hair and in between loose hair, and the sweat that potentially emanates from there dropping onto the surgical site. The surgical field is the correct term. So they don't need to be sterile, in my humble opinion. They just need to be cleaned appropriately and dried and so on.
Views on that?
Well, yeah, I think there is perhaps there's a difference between the gowns they're wearing in surgery to the scrubs that are worn around theatre or underneath those gowns. And I think within that theatre surgical environment, I don't mean walking around outside. We talk about when they're actually within surgery. Those products should be sterile. Mark's already kind of alluded to some of the reasons why. It's the same in food. We wear hair coverings because we don't want hair or sweat or anything getting into areas. But obviously, if someone's been wearing that around other areas, there is a potential. So from a point of view of reusable ones, there is, at the moment, a majority of surgeons tend to use the disposable products. So obviously they might have their own little funky cap that they wear all the time, but then going into surgery, they'll tie a disposable one over the top. So I think that's kind of the argument around the sterile for whilst you're in surgery, as opposed to just wandering around the theatre area. And it's not so much the scrubs. Absolutely, the scrubs are done to the HTMO 104, and they're kind of a bank of that. But then when they go into theatre, the products they're using, whether they are single use or reusable, are sterile products.
Okay, and Katie, have you anything to add to that?
I think what we need to remember is some of the textiles that are coming out for surgery, etc., have been through accredited laundries, which is putting them at the higher end of disinfection, and that if you're doing surgery on the placement, I would tend to agree with Emma that it would be more down that near sterile.
Okay. And what?
Rob, just interrupt. I think that what's potentially confusing people here is the word itself, sterile, because sterile is an absolute, and the masks, or indeed the head coverings that are supplied in cardboard boxes typically, that they will be fully decontaminated and should be sterile when they're coming out of the factory. As soon as you open the cardboard box and start sticking your hand in and taking out the things, they're no longer sterile. So, but they are they're nearly sterile, and it's just that point. So do you need to open up a single-use sterile product to put on someone's head, or a mask to put around their face? No, and we've said the rest.
Okay, thank you. And one question that is coming up regularly, in terms of disposable sanitizing wipes, and what are the considerations what would you consider when thinking of replacing those? When are they irreplaceable? How do you look at the sustainability issues in terms of plastics and so on? Perhaps you could enlighten me a bit about this, Emma, in terms of were they are essential?
So, I mean, I think, between patients and where clinical staff need to decontaminate stuff quickly between patient uses, so blood pressure cuffs, they are useful for those areas. However, when we look at larger areas, things like mattresses, beds, and other larger equipment, it's really key that organisations are working with their cleaning operatives to look at what's the best way to do it. I think I always use the thing, we don't go around trying to stick cannulas in patients. However, what we do well is clean professionally in a healthcare setting, using all of the standards and the methodologies at our fingertips. Now, that's not absolving anyone from responsibility, because actually cleaning is everybody's business. We all need to do that, but it's about making sure that things are safe and in the right way. And sometimes, someone who's a clinical operative that's really, really pushed, trying to get stuff done using a small wipe is not necessarily the best way to do it.
Yeah.
And there are methodologies out there that are very clear on how we should be decontaminating all of our equipment within healthcare settings.
Hey, Mark, do you have a view on that particular issue in terms of when single-use wipes are essential?
I'd keep it brief, and I think Emma's answer was spot on. So I'm not going to waffle around and try and say it in a different way, I agree.
Okay, and Katie?
Yes, that's right. I think the only other thing to say is that when you're looking at wipes, there's a dosed level of disinfection in there that's exceptionally accurate. So for certain areas, they're really useful. And I think that's it, really.
Yeah, I think finally, really, I suppose we have to look at waste considerations as well, because in healthcare, what Alistair has told me is that there's a slight advantage in that you're able to look at things in a circular way and probably have better control of the waste cycles in terms of the products you're choosing and where they are going to end up. And when thinking about that downstream issue, is it important that we consider recyclability, compostability, and what sort of weight would you put against those issues in comparison to the importance of hygiene and infection control? Do you think what happens to the waste is slightly less important than ensuring good hygiene and infection control in the hospital? Or do you think you simply need to look for the best solution for that waste? Or potential recycling when it's a single-use product. Could we begin with Emma, perhaps?
I think that's a slightly loaded question again, because it's quite difficult, that one. It is very much about where the waste goes, but it's also about the infection prevention, and that is not. They sit side by side on our list, and I think there's a big push towards looking to circular economy. So it doesn't matter whether it's a single-use product or a reusable product, but how can we kind of marry up the infection prevention risks with that product then becoming something else again, whether it's within healthcare or wider out there in the community. It's about that circular economy. So we're trying to reduce the waste we're doing, but still meeting those infection prevention things that we need to do. And every product we choose needs to have that at the forefront.
Thank you. And Katie, obviously you have had experience of sort of following the whole life cycle in the textile world, and were eventually they disposed of it. I mean, is that eventual waste stream something you spend a lot of time examining in relation to textiles and the whole life cycle?
No, not really. We do make considerations, and I think I mentioned it earlier about mixed fibre textiles not being easy to recycle. So looking at the type of textiles you can use, but there's other factors that you need to think about. So there's like the privacy curtains coming in that are coated in antimicrobials. What's the impact of that? And also, if it is something that can be recycled coming out of a healthcare environment, what's the sterilization process for that? Because obviously you don't want something that could potentially go on to be infectious. So I have been in conversations in the textile industry around these types of questions, but it's not something I know an awful lot about. So that's my depth and my knowledge on that.
Right, yeah. And I suppose to summarize for everybody, Mark, when people are thinking of choosing a product in relation to infection control, IPC, what do they need to think about to summarize? Obviously, beginning with its effectiveness, I expect.
Yeah, look, at the risk of being controversial here, a great many, the majority of infection prevention and control interventions are not robustly evidence-based. That doesn't mean I'm arguing to get rid of them, but our current state of proof regarding doing A or B or C or whatever to prevent infection spread is often weak. But we do those things for good reason. And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that sustains those practices. I think we are risking becoming delusional if we can suddenly believe that by using a washable cover to put on a couch in a radiology suite as opposed to paper ones, we can help the environment. If we really want to make an impact, and I passionately believe in global warming and doing what we can, but I'm arguing against delusion here. If we want to make an impact, what we should be doing is making sure that the intervention in question, let's say it's using a disposable, a fluid-resistant surgical mask, that those are being used for good reason. They are being used properly, not as neckties, that they are only being replaced when necessary and so on, as opposed to thinking, okay, let's get everyone in to bring in their own material mask into the healthcare setting and use those instead of fluid-resistant surgical masks, single use only, because we'll almost certainly make a non-delusional impact on global warming by ensuring appropriate use of of a particular IPC intervention, as opposed to living in la la land thinking we can just magically avoid any more landfill sites.
Thank you. And Emma, what would your approach be to making these choices, and what do you feel people need to consider?
So, I mean, I agree with Mark. I think we need to come from the guise of infection prevention first, but how are we making those decisions? Let's look at evidence, not just, well, one association said that, another trust told me that. Let's kind of sit back and think about the changes we're making. And I will come back to the thing around using linen as opposed to standard couch roll. It clearly hasn't been thought through. I think we started this at the very beginning, hand towels versus hand dryers. It's not always thought through. There may be times that's appropriate, but are we looking at the type we're using? And I think any product we're using, we have a tendency to see the next great thing as a panacea.
Yeah.
We've seen it through with ultrasonic tanks and HPV fogging, UV, all of these things. It comes out and we see it as the next panacea without the real evidence base behind it. So it's about how do we look at this? And I'm glad that both Mark and Katie are nodding. I'm not making rubbish here, but basically we've got to start looking at this as an evidence base for why would we spend that kind of money. HPV is a classic example. When they first came out, they were like the price of a small car, and organizations are running out and spending lots and lots of money. But then the reality is now evidence has shown us that a lot of places do not have the time to do that because they're trying to turn patients around. So they sit gathering dust in cupboards, having spent all this money. So it is very much about looking at, right, we've got an idea, we've heard something, let's really look into that before we run out and do it. That would be my message, I think.
Thank you. And Katie, how would you approach that in relation to healthcare textiles and the issues of infection control, sustainability? How would you run that through with a textile?
Well, I completely agree with what Mark and Emma have just said. And I think the only point that I'd maybe add to that is I think it needs to be a multidisciplinary team approach, because I think that's absolutely key to looking at this on a number of different levels, whether it's cost risk analysis, whether it's end of life use, whether it's just effectiveness based on evidence of does this thing actually work, or if it does work, is the effect of it for a few minutes till the patients walk back in the room, or etc. So I think for me, even if it isn't just related to textiles, I think generally, I think there needs to be a multidisciplinary approach, because I think that is the only approach. And I don't think that you can solve the issue or ease the pressure, I suppose, as Mark said, keeping it realistic, by just one sort of discipline looking at it. I really think it needs that approach.
Thank you very much. And to our listeners, thank you for attending. To Mark, Emma and Katie, thank you very much for your expertise. The recording will be available in a few days from the NOLEX website. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.